Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Dumfries and Galloway chapters event today. I'm just going to wait a couple of minutes just to allow everyone to get logged on to today's event. If you just bear with us just a couple more minutes, thank you. So there's people just joining. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for everyone to get logged in before we start, because we're conscious that some people just log in bang on 4, so the numbers are slowly rising. So we'll just give it another minute or two. Thank you. Numbers are still going up, so maybe just give it another couple of seconds and then we'll get going. So we're kind of we're currently at, yeah, we'll maybe just get going, and then I'll just do my introduction then before Jamie starts, so people won't have missed anything of the presentation. So yeah, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's RTPI Scotland event, which is being hosted by Dumfries and Galloway RTPI chapter. My name's Shona McCoy, and I'm convener of Dumfries and Galloway chapter. I'm also team leader for Dumfries and Galloway Council's local development planning team. So this afternoon I'm joined by Jamie Little, who also works in Dumfries and Galloway Council, and he works in the Strategic Housing Service. So this afternoon Jamie's going to give us a presentation of the Council's Town Centre Living Fund. Jamie's presentation should last about 30 minutes, thereabouts, which will then leave us hopefully plenty of time for questions at the end. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on the RTPI's YouTube channel hopefully very soon, and we'll aim to finish the session at 5 o'clock. As usual, please use the question box to leave a question, and we'll try and get through them all in the time that we've got left. If it turns out we don't have enough time, Jamie said that he's happy to provide an answer after the session, so we will get back to you. So today looks like we're joined about 42 people, and we've got people from a range of different groups and organisations, so welcome everyone, thank you. So I'll now hand over to Jamie and allow him to start his presentation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Shona, and I hope everyone's well. Unfortunately, don't get to actually see any of you, but one day may get to meet. My name's Jamie Little. As Shona said, I work in strategic housing at Dumfries and Galloway Council. I appreciate that predominantly the audience today are people from a planning background. So just in terms of strategic housing, our role in Dumfries and Galloway, we don't actually have any houses ourselves, so we provide strategic direction for housing investment. We develop the local housing strategy. I work very closely with Shona on the housing need and demand assessment for Dumfries and Galloway. And we're also always looking for opportunities to maximise investment that provides the widest range of strategic benefits we possibly can. I should say, just you probably become quite clear, I'm not a planner, but I do work very closely with our planning colleagues. So hopefully there's some interest in here for you all from the presentation, and potentially some opportunities you can reflect back into your own work. So conscious that not everybody will know Dumfries and Galloway or visited, but we're the southernmost region in Scotland, very large area, population centre in Dumfries there, predominantly rural, but we do, as you can see from this map, we're around 30 miles from Glasgow at our northernmost point, about 38 miles from Edinburgh. If any of you haven't visited Dumfries and Galloway, I can highly recommend it. It's worth a visit, especially once COVID restrictions are lifted and you're able to come and see a lovely part of the world. It's an area I've lived in all my life, and I can highly recommend it. So as I just mentioned, just some information about Dumfries and Galloway there. Population around 150,000 people. The region is 100 miles wide, as I alluded to, from Gretna in the east all the way over to Stranraer and slightly beyond down the Mull of Galloway in the west. At its tallest point, it's around 50 miles tall, and 50% of the population live in the 9 largest settlements. So as you can see, that's a significant amount of people in those towns, but we obviously are a predominantly rural region with agriculture and forestry taking up most of the land use throughout Dumfries and Galloway. Main population centres, Dumfries by far and away the largest, around 40,000 people. Stranraer, again, as I said, in the west, around 10,000. Annan is around 9,000. So you can see there's quite a disparity between the towns. Again, Dumfries being the regional capital has the most people living there. So just about to talk a little bit about the origins of the Town Centre Living Fund, why we sought to create it, how it came about, and also how we got buy-in from elected members. One of the things we were seeing coming up on a regular basis was cost of the development in town centres. While it was recognised that it provided a number of strategic benefits to develop in these areas, often came with a number of infrastructure constraints and additional costs that go along with that, as I'm sure most of you will be aware. Also, as you'll recognise, across the whole of the UK and probably the more of the world as well, there's a number of empty properties above shops. Predominantly these have been listed as storage by the shop owners or the building owners to avoid them having to pay any council tax rates on these properties. And what you can find in many cases, I'll come on to talk about the mid-steeple quarter in a couple of minutes, is that there isn't even access into these areas, that staircases have been removed to increase the floor space in the shops. But also declining demand for retail. And I suppose that while I've put that in as a bullet point, it's probably worth recognising that declining demand for certainly the large chain retail. We're certainly seeing that over the last couple of years. That's been accelerated with the loss of many shops in our high streets, but it's been a trend for a number of years. As I mentioned before, what's key as part of this as a strategic housing authority is to ensure we have the political buy-in and that there's political will to help support these funds. They recognise the issues around the empty properties, and we're obviously keen to try and find a solution to the decline of our town centres. So getting that political buy-in at an early stage was something we were keen to achieve, and were able to. There was a lot of support for this approach from our elected members. So the funding for the Town Centre Living Fund, again, appreciating that not everybody will have a significant amount of housing knowledge, but council tax on second homes income is something that's collected within probably revenues departments across Scotland and wider. Because second homes are certainly seen as detrimental to a region, particularly in terms of housing and increasing housing prices, this funding is ring-fenced for housing purposes. In the past, we've sought to allocate this to individual projects, one of which I'll highlight in a moment. But we didn't really have a particularly strategic direction around how to use this funding. We would occasionally allocate funding to projects where people, RSLs or registered social landlords, would come in and seek additional funding to try and regenerate town centres. We would also use the funding to provide grants towards empty homes or below tolerable standard properties. These could be in town centres, but tended to be in some of the more rural areas. So, as I was mentioned before, council tax on second homes was used in a number of different ways. A particular project, which some of you may well be familiar with, is Queen Street in Dumfries. The council designated Queen Street and 2 other streets in Dumfries town centre as a housing renewal area. And predominantly these were down to issues around deprivation, older housing stock, some of it poor quality, and also the aspiration to try and increase town centre living. Queen Street itself is half in the town centre, as defined by the local development plan, and half out with the town centre. But it's a main thoroughfare into the more retail areas of Dumfries. So this particular project was a gap site that DGHP, who are our local largest registered social landlord, was seeking to deliver affordable homes on this site. As you can see, it's quite an attractive development. It's made quite a difference to the area. The garden that you can see in the forefront of the picture there has actually been taken on by a community group who are also established as part of this housing renewal area. So there was a significant amount of partnership working taken as the approach here. So these properties achieved the gold standard for energy efficiency. I'm sure you can see the PV panels on the roof there, but they also have elements around water use and access in the properties. And the gold standard is not just about energy efficiency, but obviously with some of the issues around climate change and fuel poverty, that this was a key part of the project. So it provided 3 4-bedroom townhouses. There was comments prior to the development about the need for 4-bedroom townhouses, which obviously aimed at families within a town centre setting. But those properties were snapped up and continue to be occupied to this day. They've been proven to be very popular for a number of reasons, and they do have a decent garden to the rear of them as well. So in around 2017, we established the Town Centre Living Fund. Obviously, this was required elected members' agreement. There's initially a £1 million allocation provided to the fund, and then it formed part of the wider council plan, which is the document that sets out the council's priorities and objectives for a 5-year timescale. So £1 million annual allocation, that's been divvied up into a few different priorities. So town centre sites, that fundings can be applied for by registered social landlords, private developers, community groups, and registered charities that are also being supported through national funding streams, which could be the Affordable Housing Supply Programme, Rural Housing Fund, and a number of other different funding streams that are out there at the moment. Also recognising the will to ensure that we can provide a mixed tenure approach in our town centres, we also sought to put funding aside for empty properties and below tolerable standard homes that would be in the private sector. So these may be owner-occupiers or potentially private landlords who are seeking to provide another tenure type in the town centres. So these are just some of the wider benefits of the approach we were seeking to take. In terms of the climate emergency declaration, Dumfries and Galloway Council set out a very ambitious target to become a carbon neutral region by 2025. That was just in 2019, but obviously an approach to regenerating town centre sites and enabling people to be within easy walking distance of local services also helps to aid some of the aspirations around the climate emergency declaration. And just in January, a strategic action plan was agreed by the council to help deliver on that aspiration. Economic sustainability is obviously a key matter as well. Many of you will be familiar with the Town Centre Action Plan, which highlights the increase of town centre living as a great driver to creating footfall in town centres. Simply put, if you live in a town centre and you need a pint of milk, rather than jumping in your car and going to Tesco's, you may well just nip down the street and use your local newsagents or shops. So there's certainly a great drive towards the economic sustainability being provided. A key matter that is probably of a significant interest to many of the people listening in today would be improving the built environment. That's obviously a key concern, given that derelict and empty properties often just deteriorate over time, attract antisocial behaviour, and can often be a blight on the local area. An aspiration that's come more to the fore recently has been the 20-minute neighbourhood, originally a Sustrans pledge, but it's been adopted by the Scottish Government now, especially in terms of affordable housing, where effectively people are able to do all their daily business within a 20-minute walk or wheel, and by wheel they mean bike, scooter, not car, from their front door, which is obviously something that was an objective of the Town Centre Living Fund as well. But also seeks to improve areas of deprivation. Many of the town centres across Dumfries and Galloway are in our worst SIMD areas, which is the index of multiple deprivation. Predominantly that's around crime and low incomes, and a great way to try and provide a solution to crime can be almost having guardians of the town centre by having more occupants there. A great way to bring down crime levels is to have witnesses. So the more people living in these areas, the lower the crime rate is anticipated to be. But it also helps to by providing quality accommodation, you can also help to drive up the income in an area as well. So the focus of the Town Centre Living Fund, we use the local development plan definition of town centres. We do recognise that that's focused on more of a retail sector, but it provides an opportunity to inform some of the allocations that were going to be made in the future. And obviously we look at projects that come forward that will also contribute to the regeneration of these defined town centres. So as you can see, the regional centre of Dumfries there with a population of 40,000, as I mentioned before. Some of those larger town centres vary in size from 10,000 in Stranraer to around 4,500 Cost Newton Stewart. Then in some of the smaller town centres across the region, and being a rural area, we're obviously keen to try and support the rural sustainability of some of these smaller towns as well, and the fact that they're district centres. So the likes of Whitthorn and Wigtown, where the populations are in the region of 900 to 1,000 people, what we find is a small affordable housing project can make a significant impact to the sustainability of some of these smaller places, can help keep up the school roll, maybe keep the local shop open, or be the difference between a bus service being reduced or kept in place as it is. So we're focused on these town centres, but there are opportunities out with them, and we'll consider anything that can come up with a strategic benefit. So you've probably seen at the start of February that a report into the review on the Town Centre Action Plan that I mentioned before was published, predominantly promoted through Scotland's Towns Partnership, and this was known as the New Future for Scotland's Town Centres. Some of the particular recommendations that were included in that report are very similar to the objectives in the Town Centre Living Fund. So in terms of the approach they were seeking to take, it was predominantly around the housing sector incentivisation in town centres. So some of those recommendations that have been made are things that we're actively trying to do in Dumfries and Galloway. So incentivising the housing sector to prioritise town centre living. Often it can be very expensive, as I mentioned, to develop in town centres, but it does provide those wider strategic benefits. So often this comes down to the pounds and pence. So by providing a bit of infrastructure funding, we were able to help drive that aspiration pretty well in Dumfries and Galloway, and I'll come on to talk to you about a couple of those projects. Local authorities could be given enhanced ability to use more flexible funding. So through council tax on second homes, that's something we've certainly sought to do. The council tax on second homes is really meant to be a solution to some of the issues facing housing in our region, and we've sought to enable the town centre living schemes through the use of this funding. Incentivising individuals to do up long-term empty housing in or adjacent to town centres. So as I mentioned before, we have sought to support the private sector to bring empty housing back into use. in areas of market failure, which many of the town centres are, or housing market failure in particular. The investment that needs to go into bringing in up to standard some of these long-term empty properties just doesn't provide a return for the private sector, and it requires that public pump priming to make sure that these works can actually go ahead. But of particular note in the recommendations or the report itself was that it recognised the Mid-Steeple Quarter project in Dumfries as an excellent example of community innovation. I'll come on to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Some of you may well have participated in the recent webinar presented by Scott Mackay from the Mid-Steeple Quarter. So I'm not going to try and steal any of his thunder, but it's certainly worth mentioning at the moment, as we certainly see it as an exemplar project. So this was the beginnings of the Mid-Steeple Quarter, the baker's oven in Dumfries, originally bought by Dumfries and Galloway Council as part of a commercial regeneration plan in Dumfries town centre. It was a vacant building at the time. As I say, it was owned by the council, and we were approached, the council, certainly Strategic Housing, were approached by the Stove in Dumfries, who are a local community group who were keen to take on the property through a community asset transfer. They obviously required to be established as an appropriate entity. That's part of the community asset transfer process. There needs to be a proper body in place there with a business plan for how they're going to manage and use that building in the future, and also be self-sustaining. So some funding was put into the project at that early stage to establish the group, now known as Dumfries High Street Limited. They were able to carry out a number of engagement works, but they also carried out a lot of promotional work as well around the scheme and what they were seeking to do. And it caused quite a buzz around the town. I think anybody who lives locally will certainly be aware of it, and nationally it's provided an opportunity for the example to be followed. And I know that Matt Baker from the project has presented at a number of events, including the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, when we were allowed to have meetings in one place. So this just, in terms of the Mid-Steeple Quarter, it's progressed to a point where there's now a master plan agreed by the council, which forms part of the local development plan. I think that's a key matter. It gives a lot of opportunity and support from the council towards the delivery of the project. So the vision was to provide homes and commercial spaces, live-work aspiration, but also to enable community empowerment and make sure that this wasn't going to be council-led. It was going to be community-led with public sector support, but we certainly recognise that the community were able to engage with the local people in a highly effective way. So that's just another picture from the master plan there that sort of sets out the aspiration for that area of Dumfries. It has, as I mentioned, it's been adopted as a local development plan guidance, but some of the other aspirations are set out there, as you can see, around low energy homes, community activity, lively closes, and craft and retail provision in the area as well. Okay. So as I mentioned right at the start, another part of my work is the Strategic Housing Investment Plan. This sets out the priorities for affordable housing funding in Dumfries and Galloway. It's supported through the National Affordable Housing Supply Programme, and it provides an opportunity to build new affordable homes for the residents of Dumfries and Galloway. Certainly see in this area there's a significant demand for affordable housing, and something that may be slightly different in Dumfries and Galloway, although if there's any colleagues here from the borders or some of the more rural areas, they may be experiencing this as well, is that affordable housing provides the majority of new homes in Dumfries and Galloway. So this particular project, Cowes, Billington and Annan, again, for anyone who's not familiar with it, this was a former agricultural and country store, but not just the type where you could go and buy a pair of wellies or a shovel to do your gardening. You could actually go there and buy tractors, combine harvesters, So it was predominantly an industrial use. They chose a new location on the edge of Annan, which was probably far more suited to that type of build of commercial entity, sorry, and left a gap site in the town centre, which obviously we were keen to see be explored for some form of redevelopment. The community, through the Annan Regeneration Plan, had also identified it as a priority for investment. This photo shows the end product, and as you can see at the end, there's the clock tower is the town hall right in the end of the high street there. So it shows how close this project is to the town centre and the high street, and all the benefits that come with that for shops. Just continuing on to that, so site frontage on to Annan High Street. The very constrained site, but they're able to provide 27 affordable homes on this site, including 5 wheelchair accessible. I think a point that's of significant relevance to planners is the way that our local development management team worked with the registered social landlord to deliver this project, and ensuring that accessibility from the site into the town centre, particularly for people in wheelchairs, where there's a completely flat surface, there's no barriers. They're able to access a range of shops in the town centre without the need to use the mobility vehicles. They can effectively go out their front door and in a couple of minutes, be in a local cafe or shop when they are obviously open. So it's a great development from that point of view, improving people's well-being. The investment was rather expensive, in excess of £4 million to provide those 27 affordable homes. And we were able to, through the Town Centre Living Fund, provide some infrastructure funding for this project. Often you'll be aware that infrastructure issues can be a major constraint. In this particular site, it was access to services for wastewater that were required, and a drainage attenuation scheme was required for this development, and we were able to support that through an allocation from the Town Centre Living Fund. So, as I mentioned before, we're obviously keen to try and ensure that the rural areas of Dumfries and Galloway are also supported. So we take an approach to community-led housing in Dumfries and Galloway, where we work very closely with an organisation known as the South of Scotland Community Housing. That's a fairly new name. There used to be Dumfries and Galloway Small Communities Housing Trust, but they are looking to branch out across the whole of the south of Scotland and provide a similar service throughout the south of Scotland. So this particular project, the Grapes Hotel in Whithorn, it's been a long-term derelict property. I believe it's been empty for in the region of 30 years. It's in a prominent location, and given its size, as you may just about be able to see from the picture there, it really stands out in the centre of Whithorn. That would be for tourists and obviously for local residents as well. So this project is seeking to bring that building back into use and also provide wider benefits to the local community. So there's 2 phases of construction planned on this site. Initially, it'll be refurbishment of the existing hotel to provide 2 family homes. This will be part of a wider regeneration plan being led by a community group known as All Roads Lead to Whithorn, who are also looking at a community hub in the former town hall, and a number of other projects that are going to hopefully help to regenerate this small town. And then once this is complete, the aim is to then carry on, if they aren't exhausted with this already, to a new build development to the rear. It's very important to recognise that this is being led by a community group, predominantly volunteers, not professionals. They aren't construction professionals in their role in the community group, certainly. So they are looking for additional support to try and help them get this project over the line. But there's been a myriad of funding gone into this project. So the Town Centre Living Fund has put some money into it, Rural Housing Fund as well, and also the group themselves are taking on some private finance, which they'll then be seeking to pay back through the rents that they receive for these properties. So anyway, I think I've probably spoken for long enough now. And so I'll hand over back to Shona to chair a quick Q&A. And if anybody's got any questions, hopefully I can answer them just now. If there's any that I'm not able to answer, I'll certainly endeavour to come back to the group with an answer following this presentation.
Thank you, Jamie. I think everyone agree that was a really interesting presentation, so thank you very much. We've received, there's a couple of questions that have come in so far, and encourage people to ask away in the question box. So we'll kick them off now. So the first one is asking whether you've used commuted sums for affordable housing in the town centres.
Commuted sums, sorry, in terms of the allocation of funding from other projects. Is that referring to the non-plan?
No, it's more just it's more just a general question about whether commuted sums have been used to help provide affordable housing in town centres.
Okay, in terms of the commuted sums I'm familiar with, we haven't actually received a significant number for affordable housing. We tend to, through the Section 75 obligations, provide the affordable housing in the location, or look to in some way work with, funnily enough, the South of Scotland Community Housing there to try and secure that affordable housing in perpetuity. There has been a couple of small projects that have come forward, and effectively it's retained in the same budget as the council tax on second homes, so it is further supporting this area of work, but it's only been a fairly small proportion received to date. There may be future opportunities, but given that predominantly the housing development in Dumfries and Galloway has been led by the affordable housing sector, there hasn't been a significant amount of commuted sums received by the council.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course that all then relates to our developer contributions policy as well, whereas we've tended, as you say, to get affordable housing provided as part of a development rather than going down the commuted sum route. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Moving on, another question asking whether you will consider smaller towns and projects.
Yeah. What we're obviously trying to do with the funding from the Town Centre Living Fund, I mean, that's a good question, and it's something that's always on my mind, given that we are such a rural area, is to try and ensure that we're able to sustain some of those smaller towns and town centres and even villages and settlements. And what we're really looking to do is set out a strategic case to elected members. Something I should have said in the town centre sites allocation is it's elected members who make the decision around the allocation of funding. So where opportunities do arise from out with those defined town centres, elected members are given the opportunity to make a decision to allocate funding to help support those projects. There are a couple of potential projects we're in discussions with around that approach. To date, it hasn't been required, but it's certainly something we're open to. And I think looking to the future, we probably can see things like the PLACE programme as part of the Borderlands Inclusive Growth Deal as potentially an opportunity to utilise some of that funding. One of the things we're always looking for is where the community have identified that there's a need for either a regeneration project or more affordable housing, and they've potentially earmarked a site or a derelict site within their area as something they would like to see redeveloped. Some of the approaches we certainly see taken across Scotland can be for that to be affordable housing. It may become a commercial site in some way. It may be that it's rewilded or regreened to deliver both environmental benefits and also regenerate those sites. But yeah, we certainly don't take an approach where we wouldn't consider those. They're just not defined in the policy as definitely being suitable.
Okay, thank you. We've got a two-part question here. Someone asking if there's scope to increase the funding available from second homes, as there may have been a few more than usual bought in 2020. whether it's referring to staycationers and as a result of the pandemic. And then the second part of the question is asking whether there's any scope to focus on Dumfries with that funding for a short period to support other projects even more than it normally would do.
I'll take the first point first of all. I think that the council tax on second homes that we receive is obviously, it's a fairly limited budget, unfortunately, or fortunately, because the purpose of it is to try and discourage second homes and discourage the potential impact they have on a rural area like Dumfries and Galloway. Anecdotally, we are hearing tales of an increase in the purchase of second homes in places like Dumfries and Galloway, given the pandemic, given that people are looking for a bit more of a bit more space, higher quality of life as well that potentially comes from Dumfries and Galloway. But it doesn't just fund the council tax on second homes. We also use it for projects like the local handy van, which helps to retain our older people in their homes and let them live independently. Another project, dementia friendly design, where for people who are suffering with dementia, funding can be put towards just small changes in their house that can make a big impact on their lives. I'd love to have a little bit more money. I'm sure everybody would, but it can be, we'll obviously see what happens with the budget. If it increases and I can make a case for it, I'll certainly try to. But then on the point around the prioritisation of Dumfries, the Dumfries is obviously the regional centre, and again, it's anecdotal, but the majority of funding that's allocated through the Town Centre Living Fund has not intentionally, but has focused on Dumfries. We don't often control where the applications come from, although we do seek to promote the scheme widely. But it's really around making that strategic case. I have to remember, and I'm sure many of the planning authorities that are listening in will be very much the same, that if you allocate all the funding to Dumfries, then Stranraer elected members will be saying, well, where's our support? We've got the same problems as you. Annan will be saying very much the same. But if there's a strategic case and a political will, then there's certainly an opportunity to consider that.
Okay, do you think it's probably fairly safe to say that as you said there, all the various strands of the Town Centre Living Fund are well subscribed, and some of them are in fact oversubscribed? Mm-hmm. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. I mean, it is, and there's an element of work goes into trying to control the ask from a lot of people. Ideally, we'd love to, provide a significant amount of funding to try and deliver these strategic objectives. As a housing person, I'm biased, but I do think that housing provides a lot of solutions to some of the challenges we're facing in our town centres. As part of a wider programme. We do often get asked for additional funding. We have to work with the applicants to say this is a limited pot of money, but it is intended as an enabling fund. So where it's a choice between a project coming forward and actually happening or not happening, we'll try and maximise the amount of investment that's required to ensure that it does happen. And sometimes it can deliver additional benefits over just the housing. It may be around energy efficiency, or we're seeing a project that was recently supported in Dalbeattie, where the homes that are provided on that site are going to be built to passive house standards as well. So we are always looking to maximise, basically squeeze every pip out of the pound that we possibly can.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Question asking whether the homes being developed, will they be affordable in terms of, I've put an abbreviation, LHA, or is there more flexibility around rent levels and costs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the LHA, just for everybody who's not familiar, local housing allowance. So that's effectively what it sets out what's considered an affordable rent in an area, and that's predominantly around housing benefit. and what they're willing to pay in terms of the private sector. And that's something that's set nationally, and we don't have a great deal of influence over the local housing allowance. But it is considered a bit of a benchmark in terms of affordable rents in Dumfries and Galloway, and sorry, across Scotland. In terms of the scope to sort of expand on that, we're really looking to make sure that affordability is considered in the round. So as I mentioned before, the likes of high energy efficiency properties and the fact that people may not need a car anymore or may be able to walk to their work rather than either using public transport or private car or cycle. We try and look at the whole affordability from that aspect rather than simply the rent on a property. So where there's a case to say, in some circumstances, we're hearing tales of passive house homes where you're paying pounds a week to run them in terms of energy costs, and it's incredibly impressive from sort of fuel and heating costs. So obviously they provide a much more affordable lifestyle for people. We're not completely fixed on the local housing allowance. It makes sense as a benchmark, but it's not necessarily a target we're asking everybody to aim specifically at.
Okay, thank you. A question asking what kind of non-residential projects are going on as well?
Yeah, well, some of the community projects are great ones around. They are providing a very mixed development and regeneration approach. So the likes of the mid-steeple quarter that I mentioned, they're certainly looking at commercial on the ground floor and flats above, which is obviously the sort of harking back to the good old days when there used to be more people living in our town centres. So the likes of the baker's oven, there's a multitude of different strands to that. An element of commercial space, live workspace, and affordable living to the upper floors. The approach being taken in Whithorn that I mentioned in the presentation. While that's only going to be housing on that site, the groups are very much looking at ways to find a use for the currently empty town hall. That was also subject to a community asset transfer from the council to them. But another interesting project that I didn't have time to mention there was in the Booktown in Wigtown. And it's seeking to bring the former Bank of Scotland back into use as a bunkhouse, recognising that when the Booktown Festival is allowed to happen, there's not actually enough accommodation in Wigtown to meet the demand, which is obviously a challenge for them and is disappointing. So to try and seek to ensure that there's inclusive growth there, they're keen to provide a bunkhouse on the former bank. And then the former bank manager's flat is being renovated to provide housing, and there's also a store to the rear, which is going to become accessible housing. So there's opportunities to work together, and often these projects, because they're so expensive, they also need to have these wider benefits that can then attract significant funding towards them.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also as you've mentioned as well in your presentation, about the value that the funding streams can bring and the joining up with other funding projects, to, as you say, to add extra value to that project. I'm just thinking about one that we're working on in Stranraer, was trying to deliver a conservation area regeneration scheme there, and adding, there might be some not duplication, but the additionality that can bring there. So I think it's, as you were saying early on, it's about that joint partnership working within the organisation with all the various bodies and so on.
Yeah, very much. What I always find is very helpful to report to members is the amount of funding that this has enabled to be drawn down into the region from national sources, and often that can be across a multitude of different spheres. So just for talk's sake, there's projects we're working with where there's regeneration capital grant fund being put into the project, and one of my criticisms of that fund, while it's a great fund, is it can't be used for housing purposes. So we then need to make sure we're able to draw down housing where there's a sort of a mixed approach to the development, and make sure that we can work together with partners in the likes of economic development and Shona's team, obviously, in terms of the delivery of the CARS scheme in Stranraer.
Maybe building on that, but got a question from someone who's interested in the heritage conservation issues in the Dumfries Town Centre project spoke about, and particularly if compromises had to be made on the quality of materials. By that they mean timber windows, roofing, rainwater goods, etc.
Yeah, that's some of the, in terms of the conservation area and the use of the traditional materials. I think as all of us like to see that these are still retained where possible, but do recognise that they can be more costly. And in terms of the likes of empty homes and empty properties above shops, the intention of the funding is to try and support the quality of the build and make sure that if there's opportunities to support people to retain those features, that we do so. Because we work very closely with Shona's team and the council's conservation officer, we try to make sure that we're not unnecessarily funding any works that are going to potentially be detrimental to the conservation area. So we'll seek advice from Shona's team on any of those issues. But there's also a flexible approach taken by the conservation officer around recognising that while ideally you want to see these properties kept in the way that they've always been, there's also a balance to be struck there in terms of their long-term use and sustainability, and especially around some of the energy efficiency requirements of new homes, converted homes, and the energy efficiency standards that are required for private sector housing as well now, over and above. That's something that's coming in line. And it's been in place for affordable housing for quite a number of years, but we're obviously keen to try and support that. So it's about striking a balance and very much taking that pragmatic approach.
Yeah, very true. Probably falls quite neatly onto use of different buildings. Someone saying that they saw that Rosefield Mills in Dumfries is derelict. Saw that a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, it still is derelict. They're asking whether there's any prospect for new homes within that site.
That's it's obviously a very, very prominent site in Dumfries, and I think that the group there are working very hard to try and identify a long-term use for that site. It's particularly challenging. There's a number of constraints to that site. The building is in, unfortunately, very poor condition and doesn't lend itself to any sort of refurbishment works. But given its status, it's going to be a very challenging project. The site itself, from a housing perspective, there's potential opportunities there, and it's certainly not something we'd want to rule out. But it's really, because we try and work with community groups, it's really, while we'll support them, it's up to them to identify that as a suitable long-term use for the property, and then we can work to see how we actually support that to happen. The council don't tend to take a lead on these sorts of projects anymore, and we recognise that community groups are now well established and well able to. Our role is really as a sort of supporting and guiding, and I wouldn't want to say that project is or isn't going to be housing, because that's really down to the community group themselves to make that decision.
Yeah, of course, I can right in saying as well that building's been acquired by the Dumfries Historic Buildings Trust, who are busy working on various plans and schemes for that site. So hopefully something will come to fruition. Another question, does the Town Centre Living Fund only cover capital costs?
Predominantly it's capital costs, because it's really been around enabling that development. It's predominantly been used for capital costs, but it has been used for revenue as well in the past. Because of the source of income, council tax and second homes, it can be used for either revenue or capital. but it tends to be focused on some of those infrastructure constraints, and the focus has normally been on making those projects stack up at the development stage. It's not to say we don't consider revenue, and it has been used for revenue in the past, but predominantly it has gone towards capital costs.
Okay. And it probably brings us quite neatly, I think, to our final question for the moment anyway. I'm asking, overall, what are the difference per square metre in price or unit for building affordable housing in town centres or regenerating other buildings for housing rather than new build on greenfield? And would the fund help level the playing field as other planning benefits? Hopefully
Yeah,
that
that's
makes
probably, yeah, I can understand that one. I mean, that's probably not something I could fully answer in terms of the difference in costs from a greenfield build to a brownfield build. There'll be so many elements into that in terms of the cost based on the type of housing, the space that's provided, the energy efficiency measures that put in. So I don't know if I can even think of a like-for-like project that I could compare. But I certainly recognise that due to a number of the constraints in town centres, there is a significant increase in the costs in the provision of affordable housing. Sorry, Shona, the second part of that question, if you mind repeating that?
Yeah, is there, oh wait a minute, wait till I get to it again. Oh, lost it. Yeah, it was a difference in price. Town centre, yeah, sorry, I'll read it again. Overall, what are the difference per square metre in price or unit for building affordable housing in town centres or regenerate other buildings for housing rather than new build on greenfield? And would the fund help level the playing field as other planning benefits?
Yeah, the intention has been to try and level the playing field, but I think that, certainly recognise that it's a limited fund. It's, you start talking in housing developments, particularly in town centres, and £1 million can unfortunately be very easily swallowed up. It can disappear very, very quickly. So the intention is really for it to be an enabling fund. But again, so maybe reflecting back on some of the different funding streams we try and bring into these projects, particularly around the affordable housing supply programme, and I could have gone into maybe a little bit more detail in terms of the strategic housing investment plan and the aspirations that sets out for the council, prioritising town centre regeneration. And what that effectively does is it gives us the strategic case to put to the Scottish Government to say why particular projects may need over benchmark funding for certain works. So we're trying everything we possibly can to try and enable the development of town centre sites and brownfield sites, because as a council we recognise that these are far better for sustainability issues, for economic development, and particularly around the climate emergency agenda. That they're far better from those strategic points of view than building on the periphery of towns on greenfield sites. So we do everything we possibly can to level the playing field, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually able to, because they can be very expensive. There's no doubt about that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much. I think that's us. We've managed to get through all the questions, unless anyone's got any more. We've still got a couple of minutes left before the end of the session. If no more come through, just like to thank Jamie for giving up his time and giving us such an interesting presentation. Everyone that's attended today will receive a feedback survey, so you can take a couple of minutes and just fill it in and send it back. That would be very much appreciated. And maybe just do a wee bit of quick advertising for our next event, which is maybe one that Jamie referred to with the South of Scotland Community Housing Trust and the Nith Valley Leaf Trust, about a small-scale passive house development in a village just outside Dumfries called Closeburn. We're scheduled to give that on the 20th of May. So there'll be a representative from both trusts coming along and giving a talk. So if you're interested, please sign up. And on that note, I think that's us finished for just now. So let everyone get away 5 minutes early, and just thank you all again for tuning in. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.